Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to another, if much delayed, episode of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning to you.
Good morning.
It's a long time since we've had this conversation.
It is that the fortnightly slot has been knocked out by the recesses and the bank holidays. Anyway, it's very nice to be back and to reassure people we haven't stopped our conversation.
Here we are, but I have to say the first question at the start is, am I interviewing the wrong Rees-Mogg?
Oh, well, at the moment, definitely you should be interviewing Annunziata, who is storming the country and receiving incredibly popular reception. It's very interesting from a Conservative and Brexiteer point of view how well a clear Brexit message is going down.
But I did wonder when reviving the Moggcast whether we should have her along, because when we started this, you were the new kid on the block, and now it's Annunziata. But can I ask you, when did you first know she was going to join the Brexit Party?
When did I first? Annunziata had warned me in advance of what she was planning to do.
Was it a long way in advance?
No. It was a short time in advance. I can't remember precisely when, but it wasn't a long time in advance. Well, the Brexit Party hadn't been launched a long time in advance.
Were you surprised when she told you?
Not particularly. I think so many people that I know, staunch Conservatives, are thinking of voting for the Brexit Party. I obviously hope they will support the Conservative Party, but I can understand why, as I'm sure you can as well.
You didn't try to talk her out of it. You didn't say, are you really sure you want to do this? Wouldn't it be far better to stick with the Conservative Party and try to change the policy from within?
Have you met Annunziata?
Yes.
Yes, she's quite a fierce character. I wouldn't
have stopped you asking her.
I wouldn't dare try and change Annunziata or any of my sister's mind once they've made up their mind. They know what they want to do. They're all three of them are very single-minded individuals.
So you just accepted it as a fait accompli?
Of course I did. That was Annunziata's decision, and I think the people of the East Midlands are enormously fortunate to have such a good candidate.
Let's just step back from Annunziata for a moment and think about the Brexit Party more broadly. What's your reaction to it? What are your thoughts about it?
Well, it shouldn't have been necessary. That the Brexit Party has come about because of Mrs May's failure, and the point of that, the most culpable point of that, is that the extension to the 31st of October was done purely on her say-so. It was not a parliamentary motion. It was a use of EU law to trump the Withdrawal Act. The statutory instrument to confirm the change of date is only going to be debated on Monday at 4:30. And so the Prime Minister used executive authority to stop us leaving the European Union. So is it any wonder that Brexiteers are cross?
Do you blame them for voting for the Brexit Party?
I never blame people for how they vote. If you can't win voters for your party, that's your fault, not the voters' fault.
How do you try to persuade them not to, given you just set out a whole series of reasons why the government policy is unsatisfactory and why the Brexit Party, in effect, is a breath of fresh air?
Well, because I think it's very difficult, if you want a long-term success of Brexit, to think that you can do it by splitting the Brexit vote. And that when we come to a general election, assuming there is still a Brexit Party and a Conservative Party, the most likely effect of that will be to allow non-Brexit parties to win the general election. So this is part of a process rather than an individual election, and that the risk is that if people abandon the Conservative Party in the European elections, they don't neatly come back in a general election.
Just put a counter-argument for a moment. I mean, the Prime Minister promised over 100 times we would leave on March 29th. We didn't leave. She then said it would be unacceptable that we should delay leaving beyond June, I think. We're going to be in till October at least. She also said it would be unacceptable to have European elections, and we're going to have them. There's no absolute guarantee she's going to bring her withdrawal bill back, and there's an argument for saying the bill is completely flawed. Shouldn't, the argument would run, people vote for the Brexit Party to teach the Conservatives a lesson? If you vote for them under these circumstances, she'll think she can get away with anything.
Well, surely she has come to the conclusion that she can't get away with much more. That you set out the case for the prosecution extremely well, that we were told all sorts of things formally from the dispatch box. These weren't Downing Street briefings, these were statements by the Prime Minister as Prime Minister, and you come to the conclusion that what she says and what she does don't match. And no wonder people are annoyed and feel that, as she is the leader of the Conservative Party, that they're looking at something else. And that's very dangerous territory for the Conservative Party, because you can't assume we neatly recover from it. And therefore I think her culpability, not just for failing to deliver Brexit, but for the state of the Conservative Party, is very significant.
Just on the Brexit Party, before we come back to Theresa May and the withdrawal agreement and all that, is it really a party at all? It doesn't have members, as far as I can see. It's got supporters. And it doesn't, as far as I can see, either actually have any policies.
Well, it's got one big policy, and that is leaving the European Union. But of course, it's standing in European elections. The focus of the European elections is leaving the European Union. It says we should crack on and leave. That's its big policy. Now, you and I remember the 1983 and 1987 elections, when our major attack on the SDP, Liberal Alliance, was that they had no policies. They didn't know what they wanted to do on anything very much other than to be in the middle of the road. And if we got to a general election and the Brexit Party were still standing as a separate party and had candidates up and down the country, it would need to have other policies. But for a European election, I'm not sure that it does.
Could you imagine yourself supporting an electoral pact with the Brexit Party?
I don't think that really arises, because the choice is either the Conservatives deliver Brexit before the next election, at which point the Brexit Party and the Conservative Party have very similar objectives, or we haven't, in which case the Brexit Party wouldn't possibly do a pact with us. So I think in that answer to that specific question, it's very hard to see the circumstances in which that would arise.
Just suppose Brexit has been delivered, at least in the form, for the sake of the argument, as something like the withdrawal agreement, and you're on to stage 2 of the negotiation. You're on to the trade talks, immigration, fish, farming, regulation, alignment, more or less. There's the Conservative Party standing on one platform. Here's the Brexit Party dividing the pro-Brexit vote, as you say, on the other. Might not, in those circumstances, an electoral pact make some sense?
Well, I think we've got to the position in the European elections where it looks as if 75% of former Tory voters are going to vote for the Brexit Party. I think saying, oh, well, we'll do a pact with them isn't really an answer. We simply have to be the Brexit Party ourselves. That is the Tory party's future. It's very interesting if you look at how people now determine their vote. I was discussing this with the very distinguished constitutional historian Vernon Bogdan recently, and he was saying that at the last election, class as a determinator of vote had gone. You might as well have tossed a coin as guessed on class, but Brexit Remain had become the determinator of how people vote. And if the Tories have lost 3/4 of their voters by no longer delivering Brexit, then there is a real problem for the Tories that isn't compensated for simply by doing a pact at the last minute. We have to ensure that we are the party of delivering Brexit and delivering it properly.
The Mail on Sunday poll found that 2 in 5 Conservative councillors going to vote for the Brexit Party. Our own survey twice has found that 3 in 5 Conservative members are going to vote for the Brexit Party in these European elections. Is that accord with your experience on the ground?
Oh, completely. In associations that I've been speaking to, I've said who here is going to vote for the Brexit Party, and people have been publicly indicating in large numbers that they will. In one association, 2/3 of members indicated they would.
And your own?
My own, I haven't conducted the poll, but when I go around speaking to them, people are so polite. They say, I'm so sorry, I'm not supporting the Conservatives this time. And I spoke in one place in relation to the European elections. People had come purposefully to join with the Conservative candidate, and it was a very Eurosceptic event. The candidate's Eurosceptic, I'm Eurosceptic. We were all getting on like house on fire, until I said they should vote Conservative on the 23rd of May, at which point I was heckled. It is quite extraordinary, the feeling among Conservative members about the failure to deliver Brexit on time, and that is why I think we should be really concerned about ensuring that the party does deliver properly.
Without naming any names, are any of your parliamentary colleagues going to vote for the Brexit Party, as far as you know?
As far as I know, not. But I think quite a lot of members of their family, maybe.
And just finishing off on the Brexit Party and all that, just looking forward, is it possible to believe that the putting off of the date the second time and the holding of the European elections, where you get a visible reminder through your door that we've not left, you get your notice to vote or your ballot paper if you've got a postal vote, you get the election literature. Is it possible this has been an ERM moment for the Conservatives and that we will not recover?
Yes, of course it is. We should be very concerned about that. And I think the issue here really is it an ERM moment or is it a Suez moment? How did we go from Suez, international humiliation, to winning the following election with a majority of 100, whereas in 1992 we continued to decline, leading to a huge majority of the Labour Party? What is the fundamental difference?
And now looking ahead, there's the election, there's then a week's pause in which Parliament's not sitting, and then you come back. Are you confident that the Prime Minister and the government will, as indicated, bring in a bill to put the Withdrawal Act into law?
I think it would be foolish of me to make a guess now, because as I understand it, the Cabinet is meeting pretty much as we're recording this, and therefore by the time this is played to people, the decision will have been made one way or another, and therefore guessing what they're deciding in Cabinet is probably pretty futile. We'll know pretty shortly. It usually gets leaked quite quickly.
Are we sure a decision will be made in Cabinet?
Well, you can never be.
After all, various decisions the Prime Minister's taken, including apparently, we read, the decision to open the formal talks with Corbyn were not agreed in Cabinet. It's at least one version of
Well,
that.
I thought you were going to go further and say, is this government capable of making any decisions at the moment? And look at what we're discussing in Parliament. Or not
But
discussing.
I could say, is one sure any decision that's made this week will necessarily a decision that holds next week. So we come back to the question of whether or not it is likely that this Withdrawal Agreement Bill will be introduced on, say, and here's a date that's been put around, Friday, June the 5th.
Friday, June the 5th?
I think.
That seems a peculiar day on which to introduce...
Sorry, it won't be the 5th. The by-election is the 6th, which is the Thursday.
Thursday, so it'll be the 7th, so the day after.
It'll be
the day after. Sorry, I didn't think that Friday was the 5th. Why are they upsetting the parliamentary timetable in this way? Well, that's the point. Why don't they just, if they want to do it, why don't they crack on with it? It's not going to be any more popular on the 7th than it is on the 5th.
Cracking on with it would mean you do it on the Tuesday or Wednesday.
Well, why not? Why, if that's what they want to do. But who knows what they want to do?
We've not seen the bill, have we?
We haven't seen the bill, but it's not just Brexit. This government isn't doing anything. We were discussing wild animals in circuses a couple of weeks ago, and there are 19 of them, or 18 of them, because one died. I mean, it is an addled parliament and an addled government.
What's your attitude to this bill? I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the first and the second time on the meaningful vote, you voted against the government. Third time, you voted for it. Now, how are you minded to vote now we're actually going to have a bill, if we do?
Well, the reason for voting for it on the third go was so that we would leave broadly on time. That has been lost. Mrs May's deal is a very bad deal. Let's make no bones about that. So, as we've already delayed, it's hard to see any point in having a bill which fails to avoid the European elections, fails to get us out on time, fails to get the process going in the way that might have worked with a new leader coming in, because Mrs May said if it went through, she would go. I think it's rather changed from being the start of a process that a new leader could potentially run with to the Prime Minister's position being such that this is then a weight round the neck of the new leader who would be saddled with this piece of legislation regardless. So I think the dynamic is very different from the dynamic that we had before Easter.
So you're certainly not guaranteeing you're going to vote for it, and you may well vote against it. Is that the sum of...
I'm not guaranteeing anything at the moment. I think it's sensible to be a little bit cautious on these things, having not seen the bill. Unlike the Prime Minister, I quite like to make sure that what I do and what I say match. That doesn't always happen, and I did let down the DUP, of which I'm very conscious in the last vote. So one can't always do that. Sometimes events overtake one's best intentions, but I think it's sensible to be cautious.
Does having let down the DUP, as you've just put it, does that weigh heavily on you?
Well, of course it does, because I said I wouldn't and then I did. But that's not a good way to behave. I don't like behaving badly.
What persuaded you to do that?
Because I thought that with the Prime Minister going, that the backstop was not as an insuperable a difficulty as it was said to be, and that we could pull out of it in international law in reasonably short order if we had a leader with any backbone.
Is that not also true as one goes into considering the bill?
It's much more difficult when it's in legislation.
And there are, of course, other considerations with the bill, are there not, such as the possibility that customs union membership could be tacked onto it?
And the issue of the superiority of EU law, that is potentially the greatest concern. How is that put into statute? And that might always have been a difficulty for me, even on supporting Meaningful Vote 3. The method of putting the continued relationship into UK law and potential superiority of the agreement with the EU over normal law is something that people like Bill Cash and I would never have been comfortable with. So we'll have to see what the details say.
I'm sorry to go back over the past, but if that was evident in relation to a bill, it arguably might have meant one would have balked at Meaningful Vote 3.
Well, the bill wasn't published at that time, so one can't be sure of how it would have been phrased.
And of course we haven't seen the bill, which is why you're reserving your position. But it doesn't sound to me as though whatever movement there may be in the Parliamentary Party at the moment is particularly helpful to the Prime Minister. I mean, David Davis apparently saying he's going to vote against the bill, second reading, may be a straw in the wind. And here are you, who voted for the meaningful vote third time round, saying you're not at all sure you're going to vote for the second reading of this bill.
The movement amongst MPs I have been talking to who voted for Meaningful Votes 2 and 3 is away from supporting the bill. Events have changed, and the Tory party has to wake up that we lost 1,335 councillors. We lost seats that we held with overwhelming majorities, that we had 2/3 or more of the vote. And we lost them. And we lost them because we have failed to deliver. And simply thinking it's business as normal, and you should do a bit of a stitch-up with a few Labour MPs and carry on with a political establishment that set its face against the British people, and that everyone will come back to us, is for the birds. If the Tory party carries on this route, we will not be elected in 2022 or whenever a general election comes. It's the height of folly.
How much is this a consideration with colleagues? If second reading passes and the bill passes, the Prime Minister has said she'll go as party leader, but the timetable is obscure. If second reading goes down and the bill is defeated, that pretty much looks like it. She surely couldn't survive that and would have to go quickly. In other words, there's now an incentive for those who think that her premiership and leadership should end to vote against the bill at second reading. Is that a factor in the mood among your colleagues?
Well, I'm sure it's a thought that some people have had. Yes, it won't be unapparent to them.
Not a thought that you've had.
Well, I'm slightly torn because you know that I was involved in the vote of no confidence against the Prime Minister at the end of last year, and I lost. And I think if you lose, you have to accept the result and the consequences of it. And therefore, I've never thought that I should be one of the leading forces in any further attempts to persuade the Prime Minister to go. On the other hand, Have I changed my view from early December? No, of course I haven't. I don't think Theresa May is leading the country or the party successfully.
Do you think she is definitely going? I mean, let me put a scenario to you. The bill, in fact, passes and becomes an act. The Prime Minister says, well, of course I've promised to go, but not quite yet. And I'm going to have a reshuffle. So then there's a reshuffle and all sorts of new and exciting people are brought into the cabinet, and there's a bit of a stir about that. The Commons then goes off for its summer recess, comes back, it's party conference. She has quite a good conference. Her advisors say to her, well, Prime Minister, the advisors never ever want the Prime Minister to go because they're going to lose all their jobs. And they say, Prime Minister, you know, you really could hang on. This challenge in December, it may never happen now. The mood has changed. Is any of that possible?
Of course.
Or really, is it curtains for Theresa May now?
Of course, it's always possible for a Prime Minister to carry on longer than one anticipates, or than seems likely at any particular point.
So we can't guarantee.
Yeah, of course we can't.
But do you think it's now likely? And how likely do you think it is, if you think it is likely that
I think it's remarkable that the Prime Minister is still the Prime Minister as we speak. I think the most extraordinary point is when Meaningful Vote 1 is lost by 230 votes, the biggest defeat in the House of Commons. No Prime Minister previously had stayed in office after such a big defeat, or anything like such a big defeat in the House of Commons, because the basic constitutional principle is that the Prime Minister has to command the confidence of the House of Commons. And if you lose on your major piece of legislation by 230, it is hard to argue that you command the confidence of the House of Commons. And that's why we're discussing wild animals in circuses, because there's no ability to get anything else through either.
Judging from what we see and hear, your colleagues are expecting a leadership election soon, aren't they? I mean, when the Foreign Secretary is photographed with Mrs. Hunt, when James Brokenshire appears in his kitchen, when Michael Gove is photographed with his parents, you know there's a leadership election coming. And Dominic Raab is photographed with Mrs. Raab. They're all popping up. This is the traditional curtain raiser.
I was photographed
leadership
in the weekend papers with my family and my Bentley, but that was to try and promote a book rather than Phillips.
That happens a lot.
People do things for other reasons than leadership.
You don't see James Brokenshire's kitchen as often as we see your Bentley.
No, my kitchen was once shown actually but I did an interview with a wonderful Kay Burley, of whom I'm a huge admirer. And I was out, and when I got home, it was all set up to be in the kitchen, which was a bit of a surprise. And it was fascinating. People priced every item, sort of the toaster and the microwave. They said, oh, that cost how much it would have cost from wherever it came from. Fascinating people's detail. But sorry, I'm going from the point, but you're absolutely right. That, people are behaving as if there is an imminent leadership campaign, and the rank of people going on the Today programme has suddenly gone up, with cabinet ministers all going on for the 8-10 slot if they can get it.
You are supporting Boris Johnson, are you not?
I am supporting Boris Johnson,
so
yes.
We can take you out of the leadership survey, sadly.
Not sadly, no. It's long overdue. When we had a very nice lunch in Canterbury, I said to you that I didn't think it was necessary to put me in, and I think that was right. But I'm very grateful to all the people who have voted for me over the last year or so. It's very flattering, but it was never realistic. And from where we are, I think Boris Johnson is the only answer. That it's a very good piece by Trevor Kavanagh in The Sun today, explaining how Boris has a really good chance of making it work, and that you need something different. As you say, we risk being in a 1992 situation with the Tory party heading to a disastrous defeat, not just an ordinary defeat, but a really disastrous one. And that needs somebody exceptional. And there are lots of good candidates and able candidates and intelligent people who are putting their names forward. But Boris has something else, and that is something else that none of the other candidates has.
Do you think if there's a contest he will reach the final two, or will your colleagues balk at it somehow?
It's a very interesting question. I think people are beginning to see that the situation is very difficult and therefore somebody exceptional is needed. And that is making people more sympathetic to Boris than they were before. But there is certainly a Stop Boris element, an ABB element, and it will be important to see how successful they are. I think anything that smacks of an old-style political stitch-up will be very, very unpopular and will make whoever becomes the leader hampered from day one. That if somebody, Mr. or Mrs. Jones, got into the final round against Boris and won in the final round, then I think people would say, well, look, that was fine. That's democracy in action. I think if there's a stitch-up, that would be exactly the old type of politics that people have just rejected.
Are there too many candidates?
Well, I think so, yes. And one of the reasons I always knew that I would not stand was because I would never have got through the parliamentary round, and therefore what on earth was the point of splitting the Eurosceptic vote in the early stages as essentially a vanity exercise. I also think Boris is more suitable to do it than I would be. So it's not just the practicality, it's also a positive support for Boris. And I would encourage candidates to think, do they really have a realistic chance? And if they don't, wouldn't it be better and more dignified to sit on their hands and to support somebody who does have a realistic chance?
Why is it happening? I mean, why is it that we have 20 people in our survey and you can't simply blame Conservative Home for making mischief because other people give tallies of 15 or 17?
I've never blamed
these are I'm not saying you would.
I've never blamed Conservative Home for anything like that.
These are very considerable numbers, and the last leadership contest saw what, 4 or 5 people. What is it? I mean, some people would say, and I'm certainly rather minded to think this myself for what it's worth, that when you have strong monarchs, they keep the barons under control, and that what's happening at the moment is it's like looking at a medieval kingdom where there's a weak monarch and the barons are running around almost completely out of control, raiding each other's cattle and making grabs at each other's land. It's not a good sign for the whole body politic.
Okay, I wonder, or whether it's simply the run-up's been so long. Because you see, the run-up to taking over from David Cameron was very, very short, and therefore any established people could throw their hat into the ring because there hadn't been any discussion about it. Whereas now we've been having a run-up to this pretty much since the last general election result, thinking who was going to take over from Mrs. May. It seemed highly unlikely that she would fight a second general election campaign. And so that's meant names have come into the public's consciousness, have been discussed. I also think that fewer people will put their names forward than are currently gossiped about.
Will the ERG hold up over what's to come? I mean, after all, if we look back at the history of the last 9 months or so, you did have a leadership election push that didn't work. You then had one that did work, where over 100 of the colleagues voted against the Prime Minister, but she did win. And then finally, when you get to the third meaningful vote, the ERG splits. You go one way, other people who are associated with its leadership, like Mark Francois and Steve Baker, go the other. And, one now reads of the Spartans. The Spartans are the new kids on the block, if that's not a horrible mixed metaphor. And parts of the ERG appear to have been absorbed into the mainstream.
Well, let's wait and see, really, as to what happens in the vote on the bill and what the numbers are then. I think the ERG has always been a flexible term, that there have been people who are associated with it who are not formally members of it. There have been a range of views within it. But that doesn't mean there's any division in the central aim, which is to leave the European Union cleanly and to win the next election, one of which follows from the other.
Now, if you weren't busy enough already, you've written a book.
Oh, yes, I
you
have.
not?
Yes, I have. And thank you for the kind review on Conservative Fame.
I have to say, if it was a kind review, it appears to be just about the only kind
Yes,
review,
everyone else
kind
thinks
review it's
dreadful.
had.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
A.N. Wilson apparently has described it as staggeringly silly. Dominic Sandbrook said, if I can read my own writing, it's bad, boring and mind-bogglingly banal. So you've not had much luck with the reviewers.
Into which life little rain must fall. This is what critics do. They criticise. They wouldn't be doing their job or earning their crust if they didn't.
Why did you write the book?
Why did I write the book? It's a very interesting question. I think that history is made by exciting individuals. It's not made by great collective activity. It's made by people who do things. And the Victorians were extremely good at that. And I think we need more of that in the modern age. It's the 200th anniversary of Queen Victoria's birth. I've always had an interest in Queen Victoria, not least because I share a birthday with her. So her 200th anniversary and my 50th coincide.
We're going to put up a link to the chapter about Disraeli, of whom you say what, broadly speaking, in the book?
Of whom I say Disraeli is desperately underrated at the moment. I think in the Disraeli-Gladstone balance, Disraeli has gone down and Gladstone has gone up. And in stock market terms, I would short Gladstone and buy Disraeli. That Robert Blake's brilliant biography of Disraeli is highly critical. And when I started the book, I thought that I too would be more pro-Gladstone and less pro-Disraeli. But actually, Disraeli is very, very brilliant and achieves an enormous amount, and interestingly achieves a lot of what he says he wants to do in his novels. And so there's a clear path for Disraeli, which everyone always thinks he's an opportunist. And Bill Cash pointed out to me what Bright had said about him. And Bright had a conversation with Disraeli, and Disraeli had basically said, look, I know what I want to achieve, but to achieve it I've got to get there. And to get there, I've got to do all sorts of things that I'm less interested in.
Conversation with Bright, everyone remembers, or the bit of it they think they remember, is Disraeli apparently saying, according to Bright, we came here for fame. And that is sort of part of the legend of Disraeli as a unscrupulous adventurer who travelled quite light.
But then you see that Disraeli extends the franchise by nearly 1 million people, almost doubling it. And he clearly wanted to do so if you look back at what he'd been writing before, but to do so he has to pretend he's doing it by disagreeing with Gladstone. And so disagreeing with Gladstone becomes the main apparent motive, but he's got to get some diehard Tories and the Adulamites who are against extending the franchise on side to do what he seems always to have wanted to do.
It's interesting that you cite the Blake biography at the start. I think it's right that the Blake biography has generally set the tone.
I think that's absolutely right.
There's a very well-written short book about Disraeli by Douglas Hurt, an apologist to his co-author, whose name I can't remember, but whose influence is all over the book. And the book praises Disraeli for courage and imagination, but not very much else. And the Blake version of events would be that Disraeli simply used the opportunity available for him in 1867 to dish Gladstone and dish the Whigs. He wasn't really concerned about extending democracy or giving a louder voice to the working man.
But I don't think that's true. And then if you look at his speeches in the Manchester Free Trade Hall and the Crystal Palace in advance of the 1874 election, they set out a very attractive programme which appeals to exactly the people that he has enfranchised in 1867 who didn't have a vote because the registers had already been put together in the election that immediately followed that. So he's got a clear plan, clear idea, which he then does. So what is his main business of his 74 to 81 government? It is artisan dwellings. It is improvements in the condition of the people, which is exactly what he set out in his novels from his youth. It's really interesting, and I think Blake dismisses that. He says, well, you can't really assume that he wanted to do what was in his novels. They were just novels. But it's really striking that when he is Prime Minister, and it's all mainly done by his Home Secretary, but nonetheless, what he is in charge of is remarkable and an appeal to...
Who was that, Cross or W.H.
Cross, it's
Smith?
Cross.
It wasn't Smith. of course, Disraeli has a way of coming back again and again. I mean, you will quite rightly remind me, were I to err, that Disraeli never mentioned or said the words one nation. He referred to two nations, the rich and the poor.
Indeed.
But the One Nation caucus has popped up this week saying one thing or another, and it has an ancestry, this group, going all the way back to Enoch Powell and Ian MacLeod and the post-war group of Conservatives who decided they needed to reinvent conservatism, though not, Powell certainly argued later, in a particularly accommodationist or middle way or socialist-influenced manner.
No, and I mean, it's very interesting how powerful what Disraeli did was that his public health acts last until the 1930s. So you've got over 50 years of what he does being the main basis of improving the condition of the people. And Conservatives always need to get back to that, because what do we believe in? We believe in individual effort, ensuring that people are able to make their own lives and the lives of their families better and more comfortable. And that's what Disraeli did. So we're all Disraelian Conservatives. It's not the title of the left of the party. It's one that they try and use as a signal. But actually, that's what conservatism and indeed free markets are about.
Jacob, thank you very much. Who knows what will have happened by the time we next meet? There's been a lot to catch up on, and I'm sure there will be when we have the next Moggcast. So thank you very much again.
Well, and thank you too.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.